Hey guys, Taki here. The new Steam Deck OLED is an amazing handheld, and in this video, we're going to do a deep dive on the screen to help you out if you're on the fence over whether or not this is worth the upgrade. There's a lot of ground that I want to cover in this deep dive video on the screen. We're going to start off by talking about the new software changes that have gone into this new Steam Deck, and then we're going to go over the new display modes. We'll wrap that up with some panel benchmarks, and then we'll go into the big part of this video, which are the device comparisons. I tried to include as many things as possible from the comment section of my last video. We're going to look at the Steam Deck OLED versus the Switch OLED, the Steam Deck OLED versus the Steam Deck and DeckHD, the Steam Deck versus Ally, and the Steam Deck versus the Lenovo Legion Go. Let's get into it. On the software side of things, we now have this new frame limit menu, and this exists on the normal Steam Deck, but it works a bit differently on this because our panel supports a higher refresh rate. You can see right now I have this set at 90 FPS, and it's going to display that at a 90 Hz refresh rate. If you look at the FPS reading in the corner, this game can go above 60 FPS in some settings, but it's not consistent at the TDP that I have this set to. If we go into the menu and then increase this to 15 watt, you can see that we can definitely get over a steady 60 FPS, and it is really easy to notice the improved visual experience you're getting from having more frames on the screen. But let's put this back down to 8 watts and let's go to this frame limit menu and let's start configuring things. From my time with this so far, there are some instances where you're going to want to have the old menu style, but let's just stick with this new one to see what we can do. So for this game, we're not really going that high over 60 FPS. So let's go in here and let's decrease this a bit to make this a smoother experience. I'm going to go with the 45 FPS option because that's going to double up to the native 90 Hz refresh rate of this screen, and it looks great on this. In other situations, you'll be playing content that is locked at a max of 60 FPS. And for those games, they should be fine just leaving this set to the 90 Hz option, and then it will V-Sync down to 60. But I have seen some instances where you're going to want to come in here and set this to a 60 FPS lock. And I have an example on screen for that right now. Here I have Donkey Kong Country running in RetroArch, and I want you to focus on how choppy the animation looks in this first setting. I'm just going to run back and forth. And at least to my eyes, it appears that we don't have very smooth frame pacing. This can be due to a lot of things, but if we look at that frame time graph, you can see that it's all over the place. Let's see what happens when we go to the frame limit option and set it to the older 60 FPS lock. And as you can see from that frame time graph, we now have a completely smooth line and the frame pacing looks significantly better. I don't expect to have to change that option on normal PC games, but this might be something that you're gonna have to deal with when it comes to emulation. Given that we have per game profiles on the Steam Deck, this is not difficult to do. If we head into the display options, they've changed this menu a bit. You'll see for the color vibrancy on the stock Steam Deck, I have that set to sRGB. But on the new deck, sRGB is all the way over to the left, and it is set in the middle by default with native all the way over to the side. If I had to assume, using the sRGB setting is going to be limiting the colors of this panel, and if we go all the way up to native, we should be pushing into the P3 color space above sRGB. When it comes to color temperature, that was set at 7500 Kelvin on the stock Steam Deck, but now it is at 6500 Kelvin. Oddly enough, this setting doesn't appear to do anything at this point, but it does on the original Steam Deck. Finally, with this display, there will be some games that will just boot up into HDR mode automatically. And if that happens, you'll see a little icon over here next to the brightness slider that will tell you that you're in HDR mode, but it is very obvious when you're in one or not. The game that I'm playing right now supports HDR, but it's not on by default. If I go over into the option and then I turn it on, you can see that it does impact this display significantly. And if I open up that menu now, you'll see that it says it's in HDR mode. Based on what Valve said, when we're in HDR mode and the brightness slider is all the way over to the right, we should be able to measure 1000 nits of peak brightness. The next thing that I really want to look at is 90 Hz gaming. Now, we don't really have any newer performance with this APU unless there's a situation that takes advantage of our better RAM, but we should be able to play some games at 90 FPS. The main benefit of this higher refresh rate is not to be able to play these games at 90 FPS, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be possible to play retro games at 90 FPS without cranking up the TDP that high. So for this section, I want to take a look at 90 FPS gaming on retro 3D and 2D titles. We'll then take a look at the power consumption of both to see if it's worth the trade-off. Here we have Borderlands 1, and I have no doubt that this is going to run at 90 FPS without a huge TDP increase because it runs on ARM processors through emulation. In the settings right now, I have this set to 90 FPS with a 90 FPS lock V-synced in the game, and if we go over to the performance overlay, you can see that we're at 90 FPS with a charge rating of 11.9 watts. That's an estimate of the amount of power that we're using right now. It could be a bit higher than that. And if we run around in this first area a bit, The FPS will fluctuate a bit, but it is pretty solid. That was at 8 watt TDP, but we might be able to go down a bit lower than that, but I don't think it'll hold up in combat. If I go down to 6 watt TDP, we have bigger FPS swings, but we don't save enough power to really make it worth doing this. Now we're at 10.9 watts of power. If we go up to 8 watts, it's better, but we are power throttling a bit. So let's go up to 9 watts just to make this more consistent. At 9 watts, the situation improves, but we still have some dips, so let's go up to 10 watts. And if we go up to 10 watt TDP, we don't have any issues. So using this game as an example, we're at 11.4 watts of total power consumption with the brightness slider a bit under max, and this is pretty decent to be able to play this game at 90 FPS at this TDP. Let's go down to 60 FPS to see what kind of savings we would get. So here we are with a 60 FPS lock, and I have a total power consumption in this scenario at 9.4 watts. So for around 2 watts of additional power, we can get 50% more FPS. I would take that trade all day. Here's another retro 3D title. This is Oblivion, and it runs at 90 FPS at a very low TDP. It's not a locked 90 at 5 watt TDP, but it does run close to that, and we are using 8.2 watts of total power to do this. If we go down to 4 watt TDP and do a 60 FPS lock, we are using 6.8 watts of total power. Not that bad. This is by no means a retro title, but it is one that runs really well at a lower TDP. This is Resident Evil 3, and at 10 watt TDP, we're able to run this all day at 90 FPS. At this TDP, we're using around 14 watts of total power consumption to run this at 90 FPS at 800p low settings. Let's take a look at 60 FPS. If we do a 60 FPS lock, we save about 2 watts of power. 2D games are a bit easier to run at 90 FPS. This is Hades, and we're able to run this at 90 FPS with a 10 watt TDP cap. At this level, we're using around 14 watts of total power consumption. If we go with a 60 FPS lock, our total power consumption drops to around 11 watts. This one is an impressive one. This is Halls of Torment, and with a 60 FPS lock, we're using around 7 watts of total power consumption for this game. If we bump up to a 90 FPS lock, our power consumption goes just under 8 watts, and that is nuts for this game. This is the best trade-off that I saw so far. For less than 1 watt of additional power, you get 50% extra FPS. And for our final title, we have Hollow Knight, and the power consumption gap between 90 and 60 FPS is around 1 watt. So yeah, that's a lot better than I thought it would be, and I could see myself trading an additional watt of power to be able to play my favorite 2D and 3D retro titles at a higher FPS. This is a cool side perk of this new OLED panel that we have. I hope they keep this panel for the Steam Deck too, because it'll be cool to be able to play the games that are demanding by today's standards at 90 FPS in the future. You aren't only limited to retro titles here. Even something like Doom Eternal can run at around 90 FPS if you use dynamic scaling. The pace of the game is so fast that you won't be able to pick up on the loss of quality, but you will get the benefits of playing an FPS game at a faster refresh rate. As I already mentioned, the Steam Deck OLED model comes with an HDR capable display. For me, this alone isn't a reason why I would buy or not buy this device. I view this as a cool bonus or a way to better enjoy the games that I already have in my Steam library. There are a couple of things you need to know. The effect of HDR will vary from game to game. If we take a game like Ori and the Will of the Wisps, the dynamic range increase is easy for me to see with my eyes, but watching it in this video won't do it justice. There's a huge difference between the darker elements of this scene and the main character. This is an ideal HDR example. Other games won't show this big of a difference. In Spider-Man Remastered, it's a toss-up over the impact of HDR, but it's a nice bump in LEGO Star Wars. There is room for improvement here on the software side. It would be nice if there were filter options in Steam to help filter content that is HDR capable. That probably should exist for this model. Now it's time for the panel measurements, and I'm going to be throwing out a bunch of numbers at you, but I'll try to explain them as we go. Starting out with the original deck, we had 71.9% of the sRGB color space. The gap between that and 100% is the reason why colors don't look that good on a normal deck. We do have a bright screen though at 537 nits of peak brightness. I want to focus on the bar graph on the far left side. As you can see, the yellow bar and the blue bar are racing all the way to the edge, but that's not what you want to see. That means that those colors are the least accurate colors that the original deck can display. Ideally, you'd want all of these bars to be around 2 or less. When it comes to color temperature, the original deck comes in at 7900 Kelvin, which means that white elements on the screen will be cooler. Finally, our contrast ratio is pretty bad at 1058:1. Now let's look at the OLED Steam Deck. On this, we have a higher max peak brightness of 588 nits, which is right around the advertised 600 nits of peak brightness that came directly from Valve. If you look up from there, you'll see that our bar graph is in a much better situation with all of the values at 4 or lower, blue being one of the biggest improvements. And I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth, but this Steam Deck screen is so accurate that we have to move up from the sRGB color space because we already maxed this out at 99.9%. If we go up to the P3 color space, we have 90.8% coverage, which is amazing. Our color temperature is a bit lower at 6,328 Kelvin, which isn't that far from the panel target. We don't have to measure the contrast ratio since this is an OLED panel. When it comes to the ROG Ally, this has the lowest max brightness of the bunch at 461 nits of peak brightness, but the screen is tuned well based on the bar graph on the left. On this device, we have 96.5% sRGB coverage. Finally, we have the Lenovo Legion Go with 515 nits of peak brightness and 99.7% sRGB coverage. This is a good panel, but it's not tuned as well as the OLED deck. If we bump up to the P3 color space, we get a rather high reading of 96.6, which is the widest gamut of all of the handhelds in this test. So hats off to everyone at Valve and their screen supplier for doing such a good job on this screen. I don't have any complaints based on this data. Now it's time for my favorite part of this entire video, which is the device comparisons. And we're going to kick things off with the Nintendo Switch OLED versus the Steam Deck OLED. In this example, we have Donkey Kong Country running on both of these. On the Nintendo Switch, this is running through their service, and on the Steam Deck OLED, this is running through RetroArch. Now the scaling isn't the same here, so let's try to go into the Steam Deck and turn on integer scaling to see if we get a picture that's closer to the Switch. After we do that, we're left with a center image that's closer to the size of the one on the Switch. Few things I'm noticing right away. The maximum brightness on the Steam Deck is a little brighter than the Switch, so I'm going to adjust the brightness so that way they are the same or as close as I can get them. And just doing a rough adjustment, this is the closest I could get both of them. So a few things that I'm seeing here, the colors are very similar between both of these. There's only some minor changes in the colors of this dirt texture down here between the Switch and the Steam Deck. Everything else seems similar. To test this further, we're going to have to get different games on both of these screens, and I don't want Daddy Nintendo to come after me, so I took a bunch of screenshots on my Switch and put them on my deck so we can look at the same images on both of them. We're going to start off with some Breath of the Wild screenshots. These are all kind of brighter screenshots, so the big takeaway that you should get from this is that the colors are very similar between both of these panels. I see some slight difference in the color of Link's hair, but the whole scene seems very similar. I think this is one of the most valuable tests that I can do in this video because a lot of people have the OLED Switch, so if these tests start lining up like this, then that means you're going to know what to expect if you were to go out and buy the OLED Steam Deck. This is another picture where the colors are lining up very closely, as is this one, and this one, and this one. I'm just going to flip through a couple of these screenshots just so you can see how similar these panels are. I also took a couple of Tears of the Kingdom screenshots, and again, these panels look very similar to my eyes. And there are only two other screenshots that I want to look at. I picked this one in particular because there's a lot of colors on here and it can give you an idea of how each panel represents the colors. Again, these panels look extremely similar. And this is the final screenshot that I picked, and I picked this one for obvious reasons. I needed a screenshot that had a lot of black on it so that way I could see if there were any issues with this screen having etched glass. Now I don't want to feed into the hysteria that people have over this version of the OLED Steam Deck, but I am able to notice some slight differences between both of these panels that probably will not pick up on camera. That being said, it's not a big deal, but if you think it's going to be a big deal for you, then just get the mid-tier option of this OLED Steam Deck. I don't think that Valve is going to go through the trouble of selling this version without etched glass, but it could happen. And I also want to point out that this was the only scene that I could see any difference between both of these panels. Now let's move on to the original Steam Deck versus the OLED Steam Deck, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that the original Steam Deck doesn't hold up against this new one. Even if we just ignore the fact that this black part here is like completely off and it's not on this, the colors in this red portion here are way better on the OLED screen. And that's because this panel has a wider color gamut than the original one does. You can influence this a bit with something like Vibrant Deck, but it's not going to improve the colors to this extent. It's just going to make them more saturated. But let's take a look at the viewing angles because that is an astounding improvement on this new model. I killed my studio lights to make this a bit easier to see. This is a close-up shot of the OLED Steam Deck, and what I'm going to do is start tilting it in all directions so you can see that this thing doesn't have any significant light bleeding or color fringing when we do that. So here's tilting back. You can still see that text perfectly, and everything that's black is still perfectly black. And we go to the front. Same thing. And now we're going to check on the diagonals, which is usually a problem on panels. And we have nothing on this side, nothing on this one, nothing on this one, and nothing on this one. While I was editing my last video, I had this sitting on my desk, so it was like this to my head, and I was just like amazed at how good this screen looked because I'm used to seeing the normal Steam Deck from that view. Here's the original Steam Deck, and this is the close-up shot. And now we're going to go through the exact same thing again. So here's back. You should see that the screen is going to change significantly when we do that. Then we're going to go forward. Start to see some light bleeding over here on the edge. And now we're going to do the diagonals, and this is where it's going to really change. There's 1, 2, this one's really bad, 3, and 4. And just for completion's sake, here is DeckHD. The color gamut is better on this than the normal Steam Deck, but it's not as good as the OLED one. Here's the close-up view. Back. Forward. And now 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, the OLED Steam Deck is just an entirely different beast. And while we're here, we can just quickly go through some screenshots. Here's Breath of the Wild on the OLED Steam Deck and on the normal one. And here it is on DeckHD versus the OLED Steam Deck. Here's Tears of the Kingdom on the original versus OLED. And here it is on DeckHD versus OLED. And this is the last screenshot that I want to take a look at. Again with the original first and then DeckHD. So that's it for the screenshot comparisons. The only other things that I want to talk about are some of the things that you'll notice from a day-to-day standpoint if you spend a lot of time with the normal Steam Deck. Beyond just having way better color and better viewing angles, you might pick up on the fact that this screen is a bit brighter. It also seems to be a bit sharper. For some reason, it seems clearer on this. The stock screen isn't bad, like don't get me wrong, but when I'm looking at them side by side, I don't know why the text just looks clearer on this than it does on the original. This could be like a godsend if you're going to be playing games that have very small text. It should look better on this new screen than it did on the original one. So we know that this screen is brighter than the normal Steam Deck, but how dark can it get? So let's do that comparison now on both of them. So I have to shut off the studio lights again, and I have to increase the ISO on my camera to 5000 because this OLED deck gets very dark at the minimum level. So yeah, the OLED screen is a bit darker than the original one. You might notice that there's some strobing on screen right now. That is something that I can't see with the naked eye, but it is something that the camera can pick up on. A lot of people were asking me if I saw any flickering with this screen at minimum brightness levels, and I don't. I have seen that on other handhelds and I've talked about it in other reviews, but I'm not seeing it here. If I set both of these to a 40 Hz refresh rate, you'll see that the camera doesn't pick up on any of that strobing on the original deck, but it does pick it up on the OLED one, and it's a bit faster than it was before. The banding and the strobing that you can see with the camera will change depending on the refresh rate of the panel. Some of the refresh rates strobe more than others. This one's pretty significant on camera, but again, I can't see it with the naked eye. This is obviously the ROG Ally, and it's a handheld that I've spent a lot of time on. It's also a handheld that I really like. From a visual standpoint, obviously Ally doesn't have an OLED screen, but the panel that it has is very good. From the standpoint of having a very accurate display, these two are similar. There are some slight differences in the colors that are represented in this scene because the white balance isn't the same between them, and the Steam Deck screen is also a bit brighter than Ally, but the experience is very similar. Now, I've already done a video on Ally versus the Steam Deck, and all of the things from that video apply to here except for the things that dealt with the picture quality of the Steam Deck and the thermals. The thermal experience at the low end is now pretty similar between the two of these, but the Ally still is a bit quieter in the TDP range that the Steam Deck operates in. And I just want to point out the obvious, Ally has a much higher performance ceiling than the Steam Deck. That should just go without saying. So I just want to do a few things. The first thing that I want to do is take a look at the power consumption on the low end. And for this, we have Freedom Planet on both devices, and I have them both set to the minimum TDP. On the Steam Deck, that's going to be 3 watt TDP, and on Ally, that is going to be 4 watts, but it might fluctuate a bit here and there. And I will just point out that the battery capacity is not the same between both of these models, but I have the Steam Deck at around the same remaining capacity that ROG Ally has. This is still a snapshot reading, so it's not 100% accurate, but we should be able to compare the two. On Ally, with max brightness in this game, we are using 6.2 watts of power. On the Steam Deck, we're using 5 watts of power. That's not a big difference, but every little bit counts. For a simple 2D game like this, I could really enjoy this on either of these handhelds. They both have pros and cons, so let's move over to another title. If we switch to a more demanding title, we can start to talk about some of the differences between both of these. I could really see myself playing this game on either one of these. This is at 720p on both of them. And on the Steam Deck, we are using 13.7 watts of total power consumption, but on Ally, we're using 16.1. Again, not that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it is something to note. The cool thing that we can do on Ally that we can't do on the Steam Deck is we can bump up the resolution. If we choose to stay within the max TDP of the Steam Deck on Ally, we can run this game at 1080p, no problem. The benefit of Ally over Steam Deck in this situation is that the fan is quieter. But yeah, unlike the Steam Deck versus itself, this isn't a landslide in favor of the Steam Deck from a visual standpoint. These are both great handhelds. And the final handheld that we have that doesn't just completely throw to the Steam Deck from a visual standpoint is the Lenovo Legion Go. Like Ally, this device also has a great panel, and it's a lot bigger than the screen that's in the Steam Deck. This is a great screen that holds up well against the new OLED screen, but it does have some shortcomings, namely in the max brightness and in the contrast ratio. The viewing angles also aren't that great from the sides. But just like we did before, let's take a look at the power consumption of both units at the minimum level. On the Steam Deck, we have a reading of around 5 watts at 3 watt TDP. And on the Legion Go, we have 5 watt TDP for a total power consumption of 10 watts. Unlike Ally, this has a bigger battery, but the power consumption is really up there when you crank the brightness on this panel. Another thing to point out with the Lenovo Legion Go is that the fan noise is much louder than it is on the Steam Deck at these lower TDP levels. When it's the Ally versus the Steam Deck, those are pretty well matched, but even at 5 watt TDP, this fan is way louder than it needs to be. But I think that is something that can be addressed in the future. But all that being said, this is a great panel that is great for media consumption, whether that be movies or gaming, and it also has a higher refresh rate than the new screen that's in the Steam Deck. But just like on the ROG Ally, the Lenovo Legion Go has a much higher performance ceiling than the Steam Deck. But that's all I've got for this deep dive video on this Steam Deck screen. I hope if you are on the fence about whether or not you should pick this up solely based on the new visual improvements, that this video helped you make that decision. I want to leave you with this last point. Even if you don't want to buy this OLED Steam Deck, the fact that it exists is going to elevate the market to make the handhelds that you do want to buy even better. It wasn't that long ago when we didn't have many options for PC handhelds, and not all of the options that we had were good ones. Now we're at the point where there's a lot of handhelds that have a lot of good features that makes it a bit difficult to choose which one you want to go with. To me, that's a nice problem to have, and I hope this handheld has a positive impact on the handhelds that other companies make to compete with it. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see another, take a look at my first look video on the Steam Deck OLED. Happy gaming everyone, Taki out.